At 3 o'clock in the morning, far from African soil, a quiet panic spreads through Washington, D.C. Phones buzz in the Pentagon, advisors rush into the State Department, and analysts at the CA stare at figures they can hardly believe. A continent they long thought of as dependent, controllable, and perpetually in need has just flipped the script overnight. And the tremor wasn't caused by Moscow or Beijing, it came from Doha, Qatar. Qatar has just unveiled a record-breaking $103 billion investment package across 6 African countries. For decades, Africa was forced to beg for IMF loans tied with painful conditions to export raw materials for pennies, while importing finished goods for dollars to live under the constant weight of foreign dictates. Suddenly, that order is breaking apart. Imagine America waking up to discover that the very nations it lectured and pressured for generations are now signing the largest development deal in their history with a Gulf state that Washington cannot sanction, cannot bully, and cannot ignore. This isn't just about money. It's about power, pride, and payback. It's about highways built by African firms instead of Western contractors. It's about solar grids lighting up villages that once went dark at sunset. It's about a generation of African youth finally being told, you don't need to wait for permission to rise. So here's the question for you. Is this the dawn of Africa's long-awaited independence, or just another round in the global struggle for control? And if Washington truly fears losing its grip, what happens next? Please share this video if you believe Africa's story deserves to be told from the ground up, not from the headlines of foreign media. And subscribe if you know that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is more important than the spin. The announcement came like a thunderclap. In a packed press hall in Doha, Qatari officials revealed a $103 billion investment package across 6 African countries, a figure so staggering that even seasoned economists gasped. This was not another modest development grant, not a token gesture for diplomatic goodwill. It was a deliberate, calculated repositioning of Africa at the center of the global economy. For decades, the continent's development was mediated through Western financial institutions. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank decided which projects lived and which died, who received loans, and under what painful conditions. Entire economies were strangled by structural adjustment programs that cut education budgets, privatized state assets, and opened markets to foreign corporations. African nations had little choice but to comply, exporting raw materials for pennies while paying dollars for finished products. The cycle of dependency was relentless. Now Qatar has broken that cycle with a single stroke of the pen. The $103 billion package is structured not as loans with crushing interest, but as direct investments and joint ventures. The money is divided across 3 key pillars: energy, agriculture, and technology. Energy, $45 billion. This is the beating heart of the deal. Africa's persistent blackouts have long crippled its economies, forcing factories to shut down and households to live in darkness. Qatar's funds will finance massive natural gas terminals, oil refineries, and perhaps most importantly, solar megafarms that will electrify millions of homes. In countries like Burkina Faso and Niger, where electricity access has hovered below 30%, this could be transformative. Agriculture, $30 billion. For decades, American agribusiness has treated Africa as both a dumping ground and a supplier. Local farmers were undercut by subsidized imports, while raw crops like cocoa and coffee were exported cheaply. Qatar is rewriting that script. A fertilizer plant in Kenya already under construction promises to cut dependence on imports and boost yields. Across Ethiopia and Tanzania, irrigation projects and modern storage facilities will ensure African farmers feed not only their own people, but export surpluses to the Middle East and Asia. Technology, $25 billion. If Africa is to leap into the future, it cannot remain chained to outdated systems. Qatar's investment includes data centers, undersea cables, and 5G rollouts across more than 30 countries. The vision is bold: Africa hosting its own cloud services, training its own AI engineers, and building a digital economy that does not rely on Silicon Valley's permission. For millions of African youth, this means jobs in coding, logistics, cybersecurity, and innovation careers that anchor them at home instead of pushing them abroad. And this is not charity. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund is clear-eyed about its objectives. It is buying a stake in Africa's future growth. Just as China's Belt and Road reshaped Eurasia, Qatar intends to position itself as the indispensable partner for Africa's rise. What makes this different from previous foreign involvement is the terms of engagement. There are no demands for privatization, no political lectures about democracy, no hidden clauses requiring African nations to surrender control of their resources. Instead, Qatari negotiators have asked one simple question: what do you need to win? On the ground, the results are already visible. In Burkina Faso, Qatari-backed firms are paving new highways linking rural areas to major trade corridors. In Senegal, cranes dominate the skyline at Dakar's port, which is being expanded into one of West Africa's largest logistics hubs. In Kenya, thousands of workers are employed in constructing a massive fertilizer plant that will secure the country's food independence. These are not photo-op projects destined to be abandoned. They are tangible, job-creating, revenue-generating transformations. For African leaders, the symbolism is as important as the money. For the first time in living memory, they can look at Washington and Brussels and say, we have options. When the IMF threatens to withhold loans, they can shrug. When Western diplomats push for compliance, they can politely decline. The presence of Qatari financing has given them leverage, a bargaining chip that cannot be underestimated. This, then, is the essence of the announcement: not just dollars flowing in, but power flowing back to Africa. It signals a shift from dependency to partnership, from extraction to cooperation. For ordinary Africans, it means the possibility of a stable paycheck, reliable electricity, and pride in seeing their countries treated as equals. For Washington, it means something far more troubling: the beginning of a world in which Africa no longer asks for permission. The real drama began not in Doha or Dakar, but in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Within hours of Qatar's announcement, reports filtered into Western capitals. Africa, long considered a dependent player, had just signed the largest single development package in its modern history, and not with the West. In Washington, the shock was immediate. The National Security Council convened an emergency session. Intelligence briefings described panic inside the Pentagon, the State Department, and the CIA. Senior officials asked the same burning question: how did we let this happen? For decades, Africa had been managed through the familiar levers of loans, aid, and sanctions. Now suddenly those levers no longer worked. Oh, the symbolism cut especially deep. Here was Qatar, a Gulf nation with a population smaller than some African cities, writing checks larger than anything the US or Europe had ever offered. American corporations that once dictated Africa's terms found themselves sidelined. Lobbyists stormed Capitol Hill, warning lawmakers that billions in agricultural, pharmaceutical, and tech profits were at risk. France, too, was shaken. Paris has long clung to influence in West Africa through the CFA franc, a currency system that gave it enormous leverage. But now French officials worried aloud: if Qatari funds backed new independent monetary policies, the CFA could collapse, stripping France of its last colonial-era grip. For a government already reeling from military expulsions in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the thought was unbearable. And yet Washington and Paris found themselves paralyzed. They could not sanction Qatar. It supplies too much natural gas to global markets, especially to Europe. They could not bully African nations. Those countries now had fresh reserves and did not need IMF bailouts. Even military pressure seemed unthinkable. Africa's security partnerships with Turkey, Russia, and China were growing stronger by the day. This was the climax of the story. For the first time in modern history, Africa had maneuvered itself into a position where Western threats carried little weight. Every scenario discussed in Washington's panic rooms ended in the same conclusion: there was no easy way to claw back control. Meanwhile, in Beijing and Moscow, the mood was quietly celebratory. Chinese officials described Qatar's move as complementary to the Belt and Road Initiative. Russian analysts saw it as one more crack in America's dollar-dominated system. Delhi, too, welcomed the news, sensing opportunities for trade that bypassed Western gatekeepers. The balance of power was shifting visibly, and Qatar had accelerated it. On the African continent, the reaction was electric. In Ouagadougou, leaders pointed to new highways as proof that sovereignty could be built with bricks and asphalt, not speeches. In Nairobi, farmers cheered the construction of a fertilizer plant that promised independence from Western imports. In Dakar, young entrepreneurs flocked to newly funded incubators, buzzing with the idea that their innovations could now find backers without ever knocking on Silicon Valley's door. For African youth, the fastest-growing demographic on Earth, the emotional impact was profound. They had grown up under the shadow of austerity programs, watching their governments beg for loans, only to see resources flow out and debt pile up. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Africa was no longer a charity case, but the world's hottest investment destination. Western media scrambled to respond. Headlines warned of debt traps, of Gulf influence spreading unchecked, of dangers in turning away from traditional partners. But on the streets of Lagos, Addis Ababa, and Kinshasa, those warnings rang hollow. Ordinary Africans remembered who had kept them in poverty for generations and who was now offering a hand without conditions. The crescendo came when one African leader speaking anonymously to local press declared, "We are not kneeling anymore. We are standing tall." That simple phrase captured the spirit of the moment, a continent no longer content to be managed, but ready to negotiate as an equal. For Washington, this was the nightmare scenario, an Africa emboldened, no longer afraid of punishments, and openly defiant of Western dictates. For Africa, it was liberation. And for the rest of the world, it was a signal that the old game was over. If the announcement of Qatar's $103 billion package was the thunder, the real rain fell on the streets of Africa's cities and villages. For ordinary citizens, this deal was not a distant diplomatic maneuver. It was a sudden promise that daily life, long defined by shortages, outages, and frustration, might finally begin to change. In Ouagadougou, young men who once queued for hours hoping for day labor now watched bulldozers carving out new highways. Local firms, not foreign contractors, were hired to do the work, giving jobs directly to Burkina engineers and construction crews. In Nairobi, farmers lined up to apply for positions at a Qatari-backed fertilizer plant, whispering to each other about the possibility of finally cutting ties with overpriced Western imports. And in Dakar, women who had spent decades selling vegetables by candlelight began to imagine what reliable electricity could mean for their small businesses. These were not abstract changes. They were visible, tangible, and deeply human. Families saw opportunities for their children to study at newly funded universities or train in emerging tech incubators. Hospitals, once starved of resources under IMF austerity, began receiving equipment purchased with Qatari funds. For millions of Africans, the investment represented not just money but dignity, a validation that their futures mattered. The psychological shift was perhaps the most powerful of all. For generations, African citizens lived under what could be called the charity narrative, told that their survival depended on foreign aid and that prosperity could only come through Western benevolence. Now the message was different. You are partners, not beggars. That subtle change sparked a wave of pride. Social media filled with posts declaring this the dawn of a new African century. Politically, the effects rippled even faster. Leaders who had long walked a cautious line with Washington suddenly discovered new confidence. When the IMF hinted at withholding a loan, ministers in at least 2 countries laughed it off. The Qatari money was already in their accounts. When Western diplomats criticized new laws or security alliances, African officials politely listened and then ignored the advice. The fear of punishment had evaporated, replaced by leverage that Africa had rarely enjoyed. Some governments began to think bigger. In Addis Ababa, heads of state meeting at the African Union quietly discussed using the Qatari package to jumpstart long-dreamed projects, a continental railway linking West to East Africa, a joint food security program, even preliminary talks about a digital currency backed by Qatari reserves. Ideas once dismissed as fantasies under the yoke of Western oversight were suddenly on the table. The ripple effects also exposed fractures within African politics. Opposition parties in some countries demanded transparency, warning that leaders must not squander this opportunity through corruption. Civil society groups, while supportive, pushed for strict oversight to ensure that investments translated into public benefit rather than private enrichment. In many ways, the pressure from citizens increased because with new resources came new expectations. Still, one truth stood out above all: the dependency narrative was breaking. For the first time in decades, African citizens and their governments could imagine futures not chained to debt repayments or dictated by foreign powers. Instead, they spoke of building industries that served their own people first and only then the global market. In village gatherings, elders compared the moment to independence movements of the 1960s. "Back then we fought with flags," one elder told a journalist. "Now we fight with investments." The symbolism was not lost on anyone. This was a second liberation, one fought not with rifles, but with contracts and cranes. And so the civil and political consequences of Qatar's $103 billion gamble were clear. On the ground, it created jobs, infrastructure, and hope. In the halls of power, it shifted the balance of fear, granting African leaders unprecedented freedom to choose their own path. Above all, it seeded a new mentality. Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It was building a future on its own terms. For Washington, the Qatar-Africa deal landed like an earthquake. The United States had long considered Africa part of its economic chessboard, a space where loans, aid, and trade agreements functioned as levers of influence. Yet here was a Gulf nation, tiny in population, but enormous in wealth, signing a package so transformative that those levers suddenly looked obsolete. Inside, the U.S. Treasury simulations were run late into the night. What would happen if African trade increasingly bypassed the dollar, settling instead in Qatari riyals, Chinese yuan, or even local African currencies? The results were chilling, a slow but undeniable erosion of the dollar's supremacy. That supremacy had been America's hidden weapon, allowing Washington to print money for wars, enforce sanctions with devastating effect, and dictate global financial norms. If Africa defected from that system, one of the pillars of U.S. hegemony would begin to crack. American corporations were just as alarmed. Agribusiness giants that exported subsidized grain to Africa suddenly faced the prospect of African self-sufficiency. Pharmaceutical companies that charged inflated prices saw African leaders looking toward locally produced alternatives. Tech monopolies, which once imagined Africa as their next billion users, now confronted the possibility of Qatari-funded African startups competing head-to-head. Lobbyists swarmed Capitol Hill demanding action, but policymakers found their toolbox nearly empty. Sanction Qatar risk energy turmoil. Pressure African governments pushed them further into Doha's embrace. Outbid Qatar, politically impossible when U.S. voters were facing inflation at home. Globally, the reactions reflected shifting fault lines. In Beijing, officials smiled quietly. Qatar's move dovetailed with China's Belt and Road Initiative, creating parallel infrastructure corridors that bypassed Western oversight. Moscow, too, welcomed the deal as another step toward a multipolar world where U.S. dominance weakened. India, with its own hunger for African markets, saw opportunities to partner with Qatar-backed projects and reduce dependence on Western intermediaries. European capitals were more conflicted. France, already humiliated by the loss of military bases in the Sahel, panicked at the threat to the CFA franc system. Germany and the UK voiced concerns about foreign influence but lacked the financial firepower to compete. Within the EU, debates raged: should Europe align with Washington's defensive posture or quietly seek a role in Africa's new economic architecture? For older American audiences, the moment carried echoes of the Cold War. Back then, Washington's nightmare was that African nations might align with Moscow. Today, the fear is not about ideology, but independence, that Africa will simply choose its own path, rendering U.S. leverage irrelevant. That is in many ways even more threatening because it means the rules of the old game no longer apply. Beyond strategy, there was a deeper unease. For decades, America's foreign policy establishment operated on the assumption that Africa needed guidance, that it could not rise without Western hand-holding. Qatar's $103 billion gesture shattered that illusion. It suggested that Africa, given resources and respect, could define its own trajectory. That realization, more than the money itself, is what unsettled Washington most. Around the world, commentators began to frame the deal as a turning point in the global order. The Gulf, once seen as dependent on Western military protection, was now reshaping geopolitics by empowering Africa. The West, once unchallenged, was watching its monopoly slip away. And Africa, once dismissed as a perpetual victim, was now emerging as a co-equal player. The question remained: could America adapt to this new reality, or would it cling to outdated tools until they crumbled? The echoes of Qatar's $103 billion gamble are still reverberating across the globe. But one truth is already undeniable: Africa has stepped into a new chapter. This was not a donation, not a handout, but a bold statement that the continent no longer accepts being treated as a pawn in someone else's game. Highways are rising, ports are expanding, and power grids are lighting up where darkness once ruled. More importantly, dignity is being restored to millions who for too long were told to wait, to beg, to obey. But history warns us that every breakthrough invites resistance. Washington and its allies will not quietly surrender their grip. Already, Western media whispers of debt traps and hidden dangers. Lobbyists are pushing lawmakers to find ways to reassert control. And yet the momentum has shifted. Once people taste real independence, once they see alternatives with their own eyes, it is nearly impossible to force them back into submission. That is why this moment matters, not only for Africa, but for the world. A multipolar order is taking shape before our eyes, and Africa is no longer on the sidelines. The question is whether this momentum can be protected, nurtured, and expanded, or whether old powers will succeed in derailing it. So I ask you, do you believe Africa can truly break free this time, or will outside forces find new chains to impose? Can leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who speak of sovereignty and self-reliance, turn these promises into lasting structures? If you feel this is the kind of truth people need to hear, please share this video. And subscribe if you believe that Africa's rise and the courage to tell its story matters more than the headlines.